Mark had always considered himself an easygoing person. He wasn't the type to make a big deal out of little things, and he loved the idea of having a backyard pool. It was a place where he could relax after work, cool off on hot summer days, and even invite a few friends over for a barbecue or a swim. He was proud of his pool and wanted to share it with others, but not in the way things started to unfold. At first, it was all harmless enough. His neighbors, the Johnsons, lived next door with their two young kids, and they were friendly people. When the summer heat set in, they asked Mark if they could use his pool. They didn't have one of their own, and the kids were always begging to swim. Mark, being the nice guy he was, agreed. He thought it would be fine. It was just 1 or 2 days a week. He wasn't using the pool all the time anyway, so why not help them out? But as the days passed, Mark started to notice something strange. The Johnsons began to take more and more advantage of his generosity. At first, they came over in the afternoons, but soon it was every day. They'd show up unannounced, sometimes early in the morning, sometimes late in the evening. Mark found himself always coming home to see his pool full of people, some of whom he didn't even know. Neighbors from down the street would occasionally drop by, and soon, the once peaceful space in his backyard turned into a gathering spot for the entire block. It wasn't just the frequent visits that bothered him. It was the way they treated the pool. The kids would splash around, leaving water and mud everywhere. The adults would sit by the poolside, often with drinks, and sometimes they'd leave empty bottles or cans behind. Mark didn't mind cleaning up after a few guests, but this was becoming a routine. It felt like the pool wasn't his anymore. It felt more like a public pool that anyone could use at their convenience. As time went on, Mark tried to keep his cool. He didn't want to be the guy who got upset over something small, but it was getting harder to ignore. The Johnsons didn't seem to understand that Mark valued his privacy and his space. It wasn't just about the pool, it was about respect. They didn't ask anymore. They just came and used it whenever they wanted. Sometimes, they even invited their friends over without asking if it was okay. Mark was starting to feel like a doormat. One afternoon, after a long day at work, Mark returned home to find the Johnsons had thrown a full-blown pool party. There were kids jumping in and out of the water, a few adults lounging around, and even music blasting from a speaker by the fence. Mark was shocked. He hadn't been informed about the gathering. And now not only was his pool being used as a hangout spot, but it was also turning into a party zone. It was like they had completely forgotten that this was his private property. Mark walked out to his backyard, feeling the anger rise in his chest. He tried to keep it calm and polite. "Hey guys, I think this is a bit much. I didn't know you were having a party here today." But the Johnsons just waved him off. "Come on, Mark," they said. "It's just a pool. Don't be such a buzzkill." They laughed, as if his concerns didn't matter at all. That was the moment Mark knew he couldn't let this go on any longer. He had to do something about it. But what could he do that would make his point clear without causing a scene? Mark stood there, feeling frustrated and helpless. The sound of laughter and splashing echoed in his ears, and the sight of his pool, once a peaceful place for him to unwind, now looked like a busy community center. He had tried to stay calm, to be understanding, but today something inside him snapped. As he stood there watching the Johnsons' kids cannonballing into the water and their friends lounging on his furniture, a wave of anger swept over him. This wasn't just a friendly request anymore. It had become an ongoing, one-sided arrangement. He felt like a guest in his own backyard, like the pool was no longer his private escape, but a shared resource for anyone who wanted to use it. He couldn't even relax for 5 minutes after work without someone showing up to make themselves at home. The more he thought about it, the more frustrated he became. He had tried to hint at his discomfort before, but it was clear the Johnsons weren't getting the message. And now, here they were, acting like it was completely normal to just take over his space whenever they wanted. Mark watched as one of the Johnsons' friends cracked open a beer, not even bothering to clean up the bottle when he was finished. It wasn't just the noise and the constant stream of visitors. It was the disrespect, the carelessness, the way they treated the pool as if it were a public place instead of something he had worked hard to maintain. His patience was running thin, and deep down, he knew something had to change. He had always been the type to avoid conflict, preferring to solve problems with a smile or a casual conversation. But today, that didn't feel like enough. He needed to do something more than just talk. It wasn't that he wanted to be rude or aggressive, but he realized he couldn't continue letting his neighbors take advantage of him. Mark had been kind enough, but now they were pushing his boundaries, and he wasn't going to let that slide any longer. His mind raced with thoughts of how to handle the situation. What could he do to show them that they were crossing the line? He wasn't about to get into a big argument or create an uncomfortable scene. He didn't want things to get ugly, but he knew that if he didn't take action soon, the problem would only get worse. The Johnsons seemed to think they had free rein over his pool, and it was time to make it clear that his kindness shouldn't be mistaken for weakness. For a moment, Mark thought about calling them out directly, maybe confronting them in front of everyone and asking them to leave. But he quickly dismissed the idea. Confrontation rarely led to anything good. It would probably make things even more awkward. And knowing the Johnsons, they'd just laugh it off and keep doing what they were doing. No, he needed something more clever, something that would make an impact without him having to raise his voice. He stood there for a while, watching the party continue as he mulled over his options. The more he thought about it, the clearer the solution became. Mark had a reputation for being easygoing, but he knew that his patience had limits. It was time to teach the Johnsons a lesson, but he'd do it in a way that would leave them no choice but to understand. Mark spent the next few days thinking about how to handle the situation. He wasn't the type to rush into decisions, especially when it came to something as important as this. He had been patient long enough, and now it was time to act. But how could he make sure the Johnsons got the message without escalating things into an argument or making things awkward? One evening, as Mark sat in his living room, his mind started to wander. He thought back to when he first bought the pool. It had been a huge investment, one he was proud of. He remembered how much effort he had put into designing the backyard, picking out the right furniture, and maintaining the pool to make sure it was always clean and ready for use. That was supposed to be his personal space, a place where he could unwind after a long day or enjoy a quiet afternoon. Yet now it felt like something he could barely enjoy at all. It wasn't just the frequency of the Johnsons' visits, it was the sense of entitlement they seemed to have. They never asked permission, and they acted as if the pool was an extension of their own backyard. Mark realized that if he didn't do something to stop this, he would never have any peace in his own home. But what could he do that would make them understand without ruining his relationship with his neighbors? As he pondered over the issue, Mark thought about something he had seen on a TV show. The idea of a harmless prank kept coming to mind. It wasn't a bad idea. Something small, something that wouldn't harm anyone but would get the point across loud and clear. He didn't want to destroy the pool or cause any lasting damage, but he could make it clear that the Johnsons needed to stop treating his backyard like a public park. Mark didn't want to get into a confrontation or make a big scene. He needed something subtle but effective. He started researching online, looking for harmless pranks that would leave a lasting impression without causing any harm. After some searching, he found the perfect solution. Prank chemicals designed specifically to make pool water look dirty and smelly without damaging the pool itself. These chemicals could turn the water a murky green and give off a strong, unpleasant odor. It would be harmless, but the sight and smell of the pool would be enough to make anyone think twice before jumping in. Excited by his plan, Mark went out the next day to buy the necessary materials. He carefully chose the right products and made sure to read all the instructions so that everything would work as planned. He knew he had to be careful with this. He didn't want to make a mess that would be difficult to clean up. The last thing he wanted was for the prank to backfire and make even more work for him. Mark also bought a few extra supplies, just in case. He wanted to be sure that the prank would work and that it wouldn't cause any lasting damage to the pool. He had worked hard to create this space, and he wasn't about to let it be ruined by a prank gone wrong. Once everything was ready, he waited for the right moment. The Johnsons typically came over on weekends, so Mark decided to act the next Saturday morning. He could already imagine their faces when they saw the pool transformed into a disgusting, uninviting mess. He couldn't wait to see their reactions. Mark's plan was set. Now, all he had to do was wait. The next few days seemed to drag on, but Mark knew that when the time came, the Johnsons would learn a valuable lesson. He wasn't trying to be mean, but he had to show them that there were boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. And with that thought in mind, Mark felt confident that his plan would work perfectly. The following Saturday, Mark woke up early, feeling both excited and nervous about his plan. He had spent the past few days preparing everything, making sure that the chemicals he bought would work exactly as they were supposed to. Now, it was time to put his plan into action. He had one goal in mind: to make his point clear to the Johnsons once and for all, without causing any harm or creating a bigger issue than necessary. Mark stepped into his backyard, looking at the pool. It was crystal clear that morning, the water sparkling under the early sunlight. The thought of turning it into a disgusting green mess felt strange, but he knew it had to be done. He took a deep breath and carefully followed the instructions on the chemicals. With steady hands, he added the special solution to the pool, watching as the water slowly began to change. At first, it was just a faint cloudiness, but as the chemicals mixed in, the water began to darken, turning a murky, swampy green. Mark couldn't help but smile a little as he saw the change. It wasn't anything dangerous. It was a harmless prank, but it was definitely going to get the message across. He knew that the Johnsons would see the pool the next time they tried to use it, and they'd have no choice but to realize that it wasn't something they could just treat carelessly anymore. After ensuring that the pool was properly prepared, Mark turned his attention to the rest of the yard. He picked up the hose and sprayed down the patio furniture, making sure everything looked untouched. He even went the extra mile to hang up a few "pool closed for maintenance" signs around the area. Mark wanted to make sure there was no confusion when the Johnsons arrived. This was not an invitation to swim. He wasn't going to be around to explain anything. He just wanted to make it crystal clear that his pool was off limits for now. By mid-morning, everything was in place. The pool was now a murky, uninviting color, and the signs were up. Mark couldn't help but chuckle as he imagined the Johnsons' reaction when they came over later. It was a strange kind of satisfaction, knowing that his pool, something he had worked so hard to keep perfect, was now going to send a strong message. He had a feeling that they'd think twice before trying to use his pool again. Mark took a few moments to step back and admire his work. The backyard didn't look like his usual relaxing spot. Instead, it looked more like a forgotten, neglected pool. He hoped that this little trick would finally show the Johnsons that there were boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. It wasn't about being petty or mean. It was about regaining control of his own space. As the hours passed, Mark stayed inside, waiting and watching through the window. He knew the Johnsons usually came by in the afternoon to check on the pool. He was both nervous and excited, wondering how they would react when they saw the pool. He thought about how they might stand there, staring at the green water in disbelief. Would they be mad? Embarrassed? Or would they laugh it off and keep coming back, thinking it was just a temporary glitch? All Mark could do was wait and hope that this one little prank would make a lasting impression. He had no intention of causing any harm. He simply wanted to make them understand that his generosity had limits. If they didn't respect that, then he would have to make them see it in the only way that would work. Mark sat by the window, watching the time slowly tick by, ready for the moment when the Johnsons would finally arrive. He had a feeling that once they saw the pool, they would realize they had gone too far, and that, hopefully, would be the last time they ever took advantage of his kindness. It didn't take long for Mark to hear the familiar sounds of the Johnsons approaching. He'd been keeping an eye out from the window, and sure enough, Around mid-afternoon, the Johnsons' car pulled up in front of his house. Mark could see them laughing and chatting as they made their way toward the backyard. Mark leaned back in his chair, feeling a mix of excitement and anticipation. He knew this would be the moment that would either make them realize the impact of their actions or leave them more stubborn than ever. He watched as Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, along with their 2 kids, walked up the driveway, oblivious to what was waiting for them. Mark felt a small sense of satisfaction, knowing that this would be the last time they'd treat his pool like it was theirs. The signs around the pool were clear enough, but he wondered if they would still try to ignore them and go in anyway. Sure enough, as they reached the gate, Mr. Johnson looked over at the pool and stopped in his tracks. "What the heck happened to the pool?" he muttered, his voice filled with disbelief. Mrs. Johnson stood beside him, her eyes widening as she took in the sight. Mark couldn't help but smile inwardly. They had no idea what had hit them. The water was a sickly green, swirling with the faint smell of chemicals. The pool, which had once been pristine and inviting, now looked like something out of a horror movie. The Johnsons exchanged confused glances, unsure of what to make of the situation. Mr. Johnson scratched his head, clearly baffled, while his kids stood nearby, their excitement turning into disappointment. "Did something go wrong with the filter?" Mrs. Johnson asked, clearly trying to find a reasonable explanation. But Mark had a feeling that deep down, they both knew this wasn't just a malfunction. Mark waited, trying to hide his amusement. He wasn't sure if they. Mr. Johnson stood there for a few moments, staring at the pool in confusion, as if trying to figure out what had gone wrong. He peered at the murky water and then at the pool closed for maintenance signs, which Mark had carefully placed around the yard. His expression changed from one of confusion to mild irritation, and then to embarrassment as he realized what had happened. The pool, once clear and inviting, now looked like a forgotten, neglected mess. "Well, this is unexpected," Mr. Johnson finally muttered, turning to Mark with a sheepish smile. Mark stood up from his chair, walking over to them. He couldn't help but let out a small chuckle, though he quickly composed himself. "Yeah," Mark said calmly. "I noticed the pool had been getting a lot of use lately, so I decided to close it for a bit of maintenance. It's been a lot of people using it without asking, and I thought it was time for a little reminder." His voice was steady but firm. There was no need to be rude, but Mark was determined to make it clear that things needed to change. The Johnsons shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Johnson, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Oh, come on, Mark. We didn't mean to cause any trouble. We just thought it was fine to let the kids swim. We didn't realize it was bothering you so much." Mark could tell they were starting to get it, but he knew they needed a bit more of a push to understand the full extent of his frustration. "I get that you didn't mean any harm, but it wasn't just the kids using the pool. It's the fact that no one asked, and it became a daily thing. The space that I've worked hard to make nice for myself was turning into a public hangout, and that's not okay. It's about respect." The Johnsons exchanged glances, and Mark could see the realization beginning to settle in. Mrs. Johnson looked slightly embarrassed. "We didn't think of it like that," she admitted. "We thought you were just being generous, letting us use the pool." Mark nodded, his tone softer now, but still serious. "I've been more than happy to let you use it a few times, but there's a difference between being generous and being taken advantage of. It's about balance. I've got my space, and you've got yours." For a moment, the silence hung in the air as the Johnsons took in Mark's words. It wasn't a harsh confrontation, but the message had definitely landed. Mark had made it clear that the pool was not for everyone to use without permission, and it was something they needed to respect. Finally, Mr. Johnson sighed and looked at his family. "You're right, Mark. I guess we got a little carried away. We're sorry. We didn't mean to make you feel uncomfortable." He extended his hand toward Mark in a gesture of apology. "We'll make sure it doesn't happen again." Mark shook his hand firmly, feeling a sense of relief that the conversation had gone as well as it did. "Thanks, I appreciate that," he said. And no hard feelings, just a little lesson in respecting each other's space. The kids, who had been silently watching the exchange, now looked disappointed but understanding. Mr. Johnson turned to them and said, "All right, kids, we're heading home. The pool's not ready for swimming today." With that, the Johnsons began to leave, making their way back to the gate, still talking among themselves, but no longer with the carefree attitude they'd had when they arrived. Mark stood there for a moment, watching them leave. He felt a mix of satisfaction and relief. The situation had been resolved, but more importantly, the boundaries had been set. He had managed to keep things civil while still sending a clear message. The Johnsons, once oblivious to the impact of their actions, would think twice before assuming they could use his pool again. As Mark watched them walk away, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace return to his backyard. The pool was his again, his to enjoy on his terms, without the constant worry of uninvited guests. He took a deep breath, knowing that he had done the right thing. His space was important, and now the Johnsons understood that. After the Johnsons left, Mark finally felt a sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't worried about waking up to find uninvited guests in his backyard. He had set his boundaries, and the Johnsons seemed to understand. Still, a small part of him wondered if they would really keep their word. Would they respect his space, or would they eventually try to sneak back in when they thought he wasn't paying attention? To make sure there were no misunderstandings in the future, Mark decided to take a few extra steps. First, he checked his backyard fence. It was in good condition, but he added a simple lock to the gate. Nothing too extreme, just enough to prevent anyone from wandering in without permission. Then he put up one more sign that read, "Private property. Please ask before using the pool." He didn't want to seem unfriendly, but he also didn't want to leave any room for confusion. Feeling satisfied with his small improvements, Mark finally settled into a relaxing afternoon. He made himself a cold drink, sat by the pool, and enjoyed the peace and quiet. No shouting kids, no splashing water, just the sound of the wind and the occasional chirping of birds. It was exactly how he had imagined his backyard should be. As the sun began to set, Mark noticed something interesting. He saw Mr. Johnson outside, watering his lawn. Normally, the two of them would exchange quick greetings and small talk, but this time, there was something different in Mr. Johnson's expression. He looked a little awkward, like he wasn't sure what to say. Finally, after a moment of hesitation, he spoke up. "Hey, Mark," he said, clearing his throat. "I just wanted to say thanks for handling things the way you did earlier. I know we probably should have asked before using the pool so much. We didn't mean to take advantage." Mark appreciated the honesty. He gave a small nod and smiled. "I get it. It's easy to think that if something's available, it's okay to use it. I just needed to make sure my space was respected." Mr. Johnson nodded back. "Yeah, I get that now. No hard feelings." "No hard feelings," Mark replied, extending his hand. The two shook hands, and just like that, the tension that had been building over the past few weeks seemed to fade away. Mark could tell that Mr. Johnson genuinely meant what he said. It wasn't always easy to admit when you were in the wrong, and the fact that his neighbor had come over to clear the air showed that he understood the lesson. That small conversation made Mark feel even better about how he had handled things. He hadn't needed to yell or start a fight. Just a little creativity and clear communication had been enough. Over the next few days, Mark noticed a real change. The Johnsons no longer treated his backyard like their personal pool area. Their kids still played outside, but they stayed on their own property. And when the weather got hot, they set up their own inflatable pool instead of heading straight to Mark's. One afternoon, something unexpected happened. Mark was outside watering his plants when Mrs. Johnson walked over, carrying a small plate covered with foil. "Hey, Mark," she said with a warm smile. "I made some homemade cookies, and I thought you might like some." Mark was pleasantly surprised. He took the plate and thanked her. It was a small gesture, but it meant a lot. It showed that the Johnsons not only understood the message, but also wanted to make sure their relationship as neighbors stayed friendly. As Mark took a bite of the cookie, he couldn't help but smile. It had been a frustrating situation, but in the end, everything had worked out better than he had expected. He had stood his ground, earned his space back, and still managed to keep a good relationship with his neighbors. And best of all, his pool was finally his again. The next few weeks were peaceful. Mark enjoyed his backyard the way he had always intended, relaxing by the pool, reading a book in the shade, and swimming whenever he pleased. There were no unexpected visitors, no sounds of splashing water when he wasn't around, and no more signs of the Johnsons treating his space like their own. It felt good. One evening, as Mark was grilling some burgers in his backyard, he heard a familiar voice from over the fence. "Hey, Mark," Mr. Johnson called out. "That smells amazing." Mark laughed. "Yeah, I figured I'd treat myself to a good meal tonight. Nothing like a backyard barbecue." There was a brief pause before Mr. Johnson spoke again. "You know, I've been thinking. You were right about everything. I didn't realize how much we were overstepping. We should have asked before just assuming it was okay to use your pool." Mark appreciated the honesty. It wasn't always easy for people to admit they were wrong, but it seemed like Mr. Johnson had truly understood the message. "I appreciate you saying that," Mark replied. "I just needed to set some boundaries. It wasn't about keeping you guys away. It was about respect." Mr. Johnson nodded. "I get that now. And honestly, I was thinking about getting a small above-ground pool for the kids in our own yard. That way, they won't keep asking about yours." Mark smiled. "That's a great idea. I think they'd love that." The conversation ended on a friendly note, and Mark felt even better about how everything had turned out. He had worried that standing up for himself might create tension between him and the Johnsons, but instead, it had strengthened their understanding. They were still neighbors, and now they had a better relationship built on mutual respect. A few days later, Mark noticed some workers in the Johnsons' backyard, setting up a small above-ground pool. It wasn't as big as his, but it was perfect for the kids. As he watched them excitedly fill it with water, he couldn't help but feel satisfied. Instead of sneaking into his pool, they now had a place of their own to enjoy. That weekend, as Mark was lounging by his own pool, he saw Mrs. Johnson walk over with another plate of baked goods. "Hey, Mark," she said with a smile. "Just wanted to say thanks again for being patient with us. We're really glad we talked everything out." Mark took the plate and grinned. "I appreciate that. And I have to say, your cookies are becoming my favorite part of this whole situation." Mrs. Johnson laughed. "Well, I guess I'll have to keep them coming then." As she walked back to her house, Mark leaned back in his chair, enjoying the moment. He had handled the situation without anger, without ruining a friendship, and without causing unnecessary conflict. He had set his boundaries, and in the end, everyone had come out of it better. It was proof that sometimes you didn't need a big argument to solve a problem. Sometimes, all it took was a little creativity, a bit of patience, and a clear message. Mark took a sip of his cold drink and looked at the clear blue water of his pool. Finally, his backyard was exactly how he wanted it. Peaceful, private, and completely his own. And this time, it would stay that way. The end.